Good evening, everyone. My name is John McGoldrick. I'm head of the Friends Programming Committee this year, and so I have many reasons to come to our good talks, not least of which is I love them. Anyway, and we have a wonderful one this evening. So it is my pleasure really, tonight to introduce Sabine Schmidtke, who is going to be our speaker. I would say one thing, if I have it myself, if any of you happen to have one of these and is on, please turn it off. I never get mine right. I'll be embarrassed and that mine will now go off. In any event, prior to joining the Institute as a professor in the School of Historical Studies in July of 2014, Dr. Schmidt was professor of Islamic Studies and founding director of the research unit, Intellectual History of the Islamicate World, complicated title, at the Free University of Berlin. She was also a diplomat for the German Foreign Service, and she was there for 8 years and had many different functions. Her field of research, well, before I get to that, before she joined the Institute, she was, as I told you, had these jobs, and her field of research was in the history of ideas in the medieval, post-medieval, and early modern world of Islam, as reflected in the literary productions of Muslim, Jewish, and Christian writers in Arabic. Thanks to her excellent and extensive knowledge of Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, Hebrew, and Persian, Dr. Schmidtke is regarded internationally as one of the most accomplished and rigorous philologists. She has devoted herself for the past 15 years to the study and publication of mostly unexplored manuscript collections. Her collaborations and research on manuscript materials span Iran, Russia, Yemen, and beyond, and she regularly publishes both in the West and in the Islamic world. As a German trained in Islamic studies, partly at Hebrew University in Israel, where she got her BA, and partly in England, where she got her MA from the School of Oriental and African Studies and her Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Oxford. With this background, she very early developed an intense awareness of borders in every sense. Throughout her academic life, she has attempted to cross these borders wherever possible. A frequent visitor to Israel, she has been traveling regularly to the Islamic world, and particularly to Iran, Turkey, Yemen, and Oman. And she has established working contacts with leading scholars in her field in these countries. As a lead scholar on the Zaydi Manuscript Tradition Project, Dr. Schmidtke is deeply engaged in efforts to preserve, study, and democratize access to the world heritage of Islamic manuscripts. We are very pleased Dr. Schmidtke has agreed to speak with us this evening about her profoundly important work, and there will be time after she speaks for questions.
Thank you, John, for the very kind introduction. And my sincere thanks also to the Friends Executive Committee for their invitation that I speak to you today. Reducing the intellectually rich and diverse Islamic literary heritage to a bare minimum of what is seen as allegedly authentic is a strategy that is characteristic of Wahhabism, Salafism, and Jihadism and their respective proponents, including Al-Qaeda and its offshoots and the Islamic State group. Whatever goes against their interpretation of Islam is classified as heretical and banned from distribution. Moreover, libraries holding books and manuscripts that are seen as containing deviant views are targeted for destruction, as is also the case with historic monuments, shrines, and religious sites which have been destroyed over the past decades by Muslim extremists in an attempt to allegedly purge Islam. To cite Irina Bokova, the outgoing Director General of UNESCO, I quote, "The destruction of culture has become an instrument of terror in a global strategy to undermine societies, propagate intolerance, and erase memories. This cultural cleansing is a war crime that is now used as a tactic of war to tear humanity from the history it shares." End of quote. Mention should be made by way of example of atrocities such as the destruction of some 300 graves and shrines of Sufi saints in Timbuktu, Mali, during the Islamic militants' reign over the city during the summer of 2012, or the attempt to destroy some of the important manuscript collections of Timbuktu as they fled from French paratroopers in January 2013. Since many of the Timbuktu shrines are considered UNESCO World Heritage, the destructions at the hands of extremists evoked an international outcry. It was mostly thanks to the courageous attempts of the people of Timbuktu that most of the thousands of manuscripts, among them a considerable amount of Sufi literature, alongside important titles in nearly all disciplines of Islamic religious learning, were clandestinely saved and smuggled out to Bamako. Another example has received less public attention, though the significance of the literary material and the level of destruction go far beyond the case of the Timbuktu collections. It concerns the Zaydi Manuscript tradition, which is primarily preserved in the numerous private and public libraries of Yemen. Many of these libraries have been severely damaged, looted, or even destroyed over the past decades, and the continuing war in the country with its daily bombardments constitutes an imminent threat not only to the local population, but also to the cultural heritage of the country, including its libraries. So who are the Zaydis? The Zaydis are named after the great-grandson of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. This Zayd bin Ali rebelled against Umayyad rule in Kufa in 714. Since the Zaydis endorsed the notion that the religio-political leadership is a prerogative of the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, they can rightfully be characterized as a Shi'i community. However, their overall doctrinal outlook situates them between Twelver Shi'is on the one hand and Sunnis on the other. As a result, the Zaydis entertained over the centuries closer intellectual relations with their Muslim fellows, beyond the narrow confines of their own denominational subgroup, than had been the case with other Shi'i groups and with mainstream Sunnis. Since the 9th century, the Zaydi community had flourished mainly in two regions, namely the mountainous northern highlands of Yemen and the Caspian region of northern Iran. The Zaydis of northern Iran were intimately familiar with the intellectual trends of their time and often actively participated in them. One of the leading intellectual centers during the second half of the 10th and during the 11th century was Ray, which is nowadays a part of Tehran. The capital of the Buyid dynasty at the time, at the center of the leading rationalist movement of the Mu'tazila, a movement that not only enjoyed the patronage of leading government officials, but that also attracted the Zaydi elite. By contrast, the Zaydis of Yemen remained over several centuries largely isolated from their co-religionists in Iran as a result of their political isolation and the country's geographical remoteness. In the early 12th century, a rapprochement between the two communities began, which eventually resulted in their political unification. This political development was accompanied by a transfer of knowledge from northern Iran to Yemen that comprised nearly the entire religious and literary legacy of the Caspian Zaydism. The historical sources inform us in detail about the mechanism of this process. Throughout the 12th century, various prolific Zaydi scholars from the Caspian region were invited to come to Yemen. They brought along numerous books by Iranian and other authors and acted as teachers to the community's spiritual and political leaders, the Imams, and to other scholars in Yemen. At the same time, Zaydi scholars in Yemen left for Iran and Iraq for the purpose of studying. And here you have the example of one title page of a book that was transferred, that was written in the 6th century of the Hijra, transferred to Yemen. And on the title page, you not only have the title and the author of the book, but you have the whole chain of teachers and students that led up to the first scholar in Yemen who received the book. During the reign of Imam Mansur Billah, at the turn of the 13th century, the knowledge transfer to Yemen reached its peak. Some of the libraries in Yemen that were founded during this period continue to exist up until today. This is the case by way of example for the library that was founded by Imam Mansur Billah in his capital Zafar. The library grew steadily over the centuries and was transferred during the early 20th century to the newly founded Al-Khizana al-Mutawakkiliyah, nowadays the Library of Religious Endowments, or the Eastern Library, located on the premises of the Great Mosque in Sana'a, in an annex building that had been constructed for this purpose by the order of Imam Yahya Hamiduddin. And this is what you see here from the inside and from the outside. The Zaydi literary tradition is among the richest and most variegated ones within Islamic civilization, and at the same time, one of the least studied. The literary production by Zaydi scholars stretches over more than 1,000 years, covering a wide spectrum of traditional disciplines such as Quranic exegesis, law and theology, legal theory, etc. Moreover, as the Zaydis were at all times familiar with the surrounding intellectual strands beyond the confines of their own community and actively involved in them, the typical library of a Zaydi scholar would comprise not only works belonging to his own religious tradition, but also an array of titles of authors from other communities, including the literary legacy of the Mu'tazila, one of the most important rational schools in the history of Muslim theology. The Yemeni manuscript collections thus constitute a unique treasure trove for large segments of the Islamic intellectual tradition, Sunni as well as Shi'i, much of which has not survived elsewhere in the Islamic world. And again, you have an example here of a theological summa by the 11th century author Abdul Jabbar al-Hamadani. The whole book consists of 20 volumes, so it's really huge. Of these 20 volumes, we have 16 that are preserved, and these 16 are exclusively preserved in Yemen. If we didn't have the Yemeni libraries, we would know nothing about this tradition and certainly not about this author. It is fortunate that the majority of Zaydi literature is still extant, mostly in the form of manuscripts. On the downside, the Zaydi manuscript tradition is widely dispersed and for the most part poorly documented. The most significant and by far largest collections of Zaydi manuscripts are housed by the numerous public and private libraries of Yemen. Estimates range between 40,000 to 100,000 manuscripts. As a result of the geographical isolation of Yemen, the scholarly exploration of its political and intellectual history and of its rich manuscript holdings started later than in most other parts of the Islamic world. Towards the end of the 19th century, a number of European explorers and merchants traveled to Yemen, where they gathered considerable collections of manuscripts that they later sold to European libraries. Mention should be made of the Austrian Eduard Glaser, who visited Yemen on 4 occasions between 1882 and 1894 and sold his nearly 900 manuscripts to the State Library in Berlin, the British Museum, and the Austrian National Library. The most significant collection of Zaydi manuscripts outside of Yemen, close to 2,000 manuscripts, was brought together by the Italian merchant Giuseppe Caprotti and donated at the beginning of the 20th century to the Biblioteca Ambrosiana in Milan, Italy. Important collections of Zaydi manuscripts are also owned by Leiden University Library, the Bavarian State Library in Munich, Vatican Library, Princeton University Library, and Yale University Library. Taken together, the libraries of Europe and North America hold some 11,000 manuscripts of Yemeni provenance that are relevant to Zaydi studies. Among them, countless unique or otherwise exceptionally precious codices. And I have here two examples, both of them coming from Berlin, both of them copied in the 12th century, both of them theological treatises. These are unique copies. No other place, library has any copy of these works, and they're certainly not attested anywhere in Yemen. Of importance are, moreover, the many libraries of the Middle East, especially in Egypt, Syria, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq, as well as India, with substantial holdings in Zaydi manuscripts. The history of the libraries and manuscript collections inside Yemen still needs to be written, a difficult task in view of the turmoil the country has experienced over most of the 20th and early 21st centuries and continues to be exposed to. Many of the libraries of Yemen were time and again affected by instances of loss of books through theft, confiscations, and even destructions of entire collections. Incidents of destruction of private book collections occurred, for example, during the Ottoman occupation of major parts of Yemen between 1547 and 1629, and again between 1872 and 1918. Moreover, from the second half of the 19th century onwards, manuscripts became a highly valuable commodity when European, Turkish, and Saudi merchants and travelers to Yemen began to purchase thousands of manuscripts, which are nowadays housed by libraries outside of the country. In fact, one of the principal purposes behind Imam Yahya Hamiduddin's previously mentioned founding in 1925 of the Khizana Mutawakkiliya in Sana'a, where he had the remains of the former ruler's library in Zafar transferred to, was to put a stop to theft and other losses. The numerous codices that had originally been produced for the library of Amansu Billah and were sold at the end of the 19th and beginning of 20th century to various libraries in Europe and elsewhere indicates that this was indeed a very serious concern. On this slide you have a manuscript that is up until today in the Eastern Library, and as you can see here you have first of all the stamp of the library. Then each of these manuscripts has a note stating in detail, and here's the transcription, but it goes around here, that this belongs to the library that was first in Zafar and was transferred in 1348 of the Hijra to the newly founded library in Sana'a. The number at the right end, which is the former shelf mark, was also added after the transfer of the manuscripts to Sana'a itself. And of course, similar remarks are missing in anything that you find in libraries outside of Yemen, although it is clear that they also originated in the ruler's library. Now, confiscations of private libraries also frequently occurred over the course of the 20th century, as was repeatedly the case, for example, under the reign of Imam Ahmad, who rose to power in 1948. Following the coup d'etat of 1962, the former palace library and the personal collections of the members of the royal family, as well as the collections of former ministers and government officials, were confiscated and eventually transferred to the newly founded House of Manuscripts. The unpacking and arranging of thousands of codices, as well as the assignment of shelf marks, was a slow and gradual process. Over the decades, the shelf mark system of the House of Manuscript holdings was changed repeatedly, as is reflected in the two catalogues of its holdings of 1978 and 2005. During my visit to Sana'a in the summer of 2009, yet another attempt was made to recatalog the collection and to assign new shelf marks to the codices. Moreover, the collection still seems to be growing. A large number of confiscated codices, some 3,400 volumes, were handed over to the House of Manuscripts as recent as 2014. The history and the holdings of the many private libraries and libraries that were attached to mosques and madrasas throughout Yemen remains largely undocumented, and the current situation is in most cases uncertain. Only a fraction of the smaller libraries of Yemen have by now been catalogued, and the few available catalogues seem to cover only portions of the holdings of the relevant libraries. There are other factors which need to be taken into account. Family libraries change ownership from generation to generation and often divided among the heirs as a result. It is often unclear whether a library quoted in the earlier literature still exists, and if so, under whose ownership. Moreover, for centuries, manuscripts have been a commodity in Yemen, and illicit trafficking in cultural objects, including manuscripts, continues up until today. Over the second half of the 20th and the first decades of the 21st century, Yemeni authorities have been constantly fighting manuscript dealers, trying to prevent them from smuggling manuscripts out of the country. In addition to this, many of the libraries of Yemen have been severely damaged, looted, or even destroyed over the past decades as a result of the political turmoil and wars that Yemen has witnessed. And the continuing war in the country constitutes an imminent threat not only to the population but also to Yemen's cultural heritage. In view of the richness and the uniqueness of the manuscript holdings of the many public and private libraries in Yemen, various international projects have been launched since the early 50s to salvage some of these treasures. In 1951, in 64, and again in 74, scholarly expeditions from Egypt were dispatched to Yemen. They explored the holdings of some of the most important public and private libraries in Yemen and other cities and produced microfilms of selected manuscripts which they brought back to Cairo. In 1982 and 85, delegations from Kuwait assessed and partly microfilmed the manuscripts of the Ahqaf Library in Tarim and the House of Manuscripts in Sana'a. Iranian governmental and private institutions also engaged in filming significant numbers of Yemeni manuscripts at the turn of the millennium. The various initiatives to produce surrogates of manuscripts, be it in microform or digitally, did not aim at preserving the manuscripts. The intention was rather to make them accessible to the respective local scholarly community in Egypt, Kuwait, or Iran, hence the selective approach in all those endeavors. Characteristically, the surrogates are housed in the respective institution that was in charge of filming them in the first place, with no attempt to make them available to a larger audience. It is only in the case of Iran that the digital surrogates prepared were also made available to the Imam Zaid bin Ali Cultural Foundation in Sana'a, whose personnel continued to digitize the holdings of additional private libraries. Two more recent digitization efforts supported by the German Foreign Office and the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft in conjunction with the National Endowment for the Humanities also aimed at capturing a select number of private collections. Again, only a fraction of these digitized materials are available through open access to date. With few exceptions, the earlier microfilming and digitization projects did not include any of the European or US collections, and little, if any, thought had been given to the question how Yemeni scholars might gain access to the Yemeni Zaydi holdings of libraries outside of their country. Even when they are aware of the existence of manuscripts outside of Yemen that are relevant to their work, it is virtually impossible for Yemeni scholars to gain access to them. And although some Western libraries with significant holdings of Yemeni manuscripts adopt an open access policy, only a fraction of the Zaydi manuscripts in Europe and the US has so far been digitized and is available online. I'm not aware, for example, of a single critical edition prepared by a scholar of Yemen in which manuscripts from Europe or the US have been consulted alongside copies from Yemen. The Zaydi Manuscript Tradition Project aims at salvaging the Zaydi literary tradition by gathering digital surrogates of as many Zaydi manuscripts as possible in a single repository and providing comprehensive and systematic open access to them for scholars worldwide, regardless of whether the physical manuscripts are preserved in Europe or North America, in Yemen or elsewhere in the Middle East. The ZMT is a joint project initiated by the Institute for Advanced Study in partnership with the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library at St. John's University, Collegeville, Minnesota. Work on the ZMT began in September 2016, and to date, the project comprises some 1,000 digitized manuscripts from several European and Yemeni libraries, which are accessible online through the project's portal and Hill Museum's virtual reading room. The initiative consists of two components: a digital portal on the IAS website that serves as a comprehensive research guide to relevant collections of Zaydi manuscripts, providing precise information on the location of each collection with a full list of its holdings and the relevant bibliography for each single codex. The digital portal further functions as the gateway to the manuscript surrogates that are available in Hill Museum's virtual reading room, which serves as a repository for digital surrogates of manuscript codices and will eventually include full metadata for the manuscripts through its cataloging tools. The relations between the two is outlined here in the slides. In this case, we are talking about a manuscript from the Austrian National Library, which have their own repository. In these cases, we also link, of course, to their repository. So whenever there is a local repository, which is only, of course, it doesn't work for Yemen because there's nothing. But in the case of European or US libraries, we integrate them as well. Among the collections that have recently been processed for inclusion in the ZMT project are the manuscripts of the library of the Imam al-Hadi Mosque in Şa'da, which was bombed in May 2015. The manuscripts were rescued and are nowadays safely stored away in an unknown location in Şa'da or its vicinity. The history of the collection is characteristic for many manuscript libraries of Yemen, private as well as public. While the mosque was constructed still during the lifetime of Imam Hadi in the 9th century of the Common Era, the library was set up only during the early 20th century, together with a religious school which is also located on the premises of the mosque. While the library was counted at some point among the most important mosque libraries of Yemen, the situation began to deteriorate sometime before the revolution of 1962 with the appointment of al-Qadi Dabash as its custodian, who was succeeded after his demise by his son Salih. During that term, the library suffered from neglect and was subject to regular incidents of burglary and theft. The situation improved again during the 90s following the appointment of Ahmad al-Shami as Minister of Religious Endowments and Guidance, and he took measures to salvage the library and also encouraged the preparation of a catalogue of its holdings. In his survey of manuscript libraries of Yemen in 1993, Abdel Wahab al-Muayyad gives the total number of manuscripts in the collection as around 100, adding that the collection has been halved over the last 30 years owing to several factors, including war. The figure provided by al-Muayyad is corroborated by a catalogue prepared by Abdallah Hamoud Dirham al-Izzi, which was completed in 2000 and published in 2004. The highest shelf mark recorded by al-Izzi is 218, while his catalogue covers a total of only 131 codices. On the basis of al-Izzi's catalogue, in which the individual shelf marks are recorded, the arrangement of the manuscripts in the library looks as follows. And here you can see basically the typical disciplines of religious learning. Theology comes first, legal theory, rhetorics, Quranic science, exegesis, tradition, law of inheritance, asceticism and mysticism, grammar, law, and multi-text volumes, which is a mix of everything. What you can see, what is striking here, law and law of inheritance and legal theory, these are clearly the most important fields among the fields that are represented. In addition to these, the digital collection of the Imam al-Hadi library, which was produced around the same time, around 2000-2001, comprises 21 codices that are not described in al-Izzi's catalogue. This suggests that al-Izzi's catalogue covers only a part of the library's holdings. The actual size and scope of its manuscript collection thus remains uncertain, an observation that applies to most, if not all, published catalogues of manuscript collections in mosque libraries or of collections in family ownership in Yemen. Al-Izzi's partial catalogue of the collection and, more importantly, the digital surrogates that are now accessible through Hill Museum's virtual reading room provide a sound material basis to study the curriculum that was taught at the religious school in Şa'da, especially when compared with other collections that have either already been uploaded or will be uploaded in the future. The majority of titles represent the standard canon of Zaydi scholarship at the turn of the 20th century, with, as we saw, a clear focus on Islamic law that is suggested by the proportionately high percentage of works on law, legal theory, and inheritance law. At the same time, the Imam al-Hadi library houses a number of rarities by authors both within the Zaydi tradition and beyond. A noteworthy work in the field of theology within the Zaydi tradition is what you see here. The title is Umdat al-Mustashidin. The title page is not there, also the end of the work is not there. A comprehensive theological summa by the prominent 13th century Yemeni theologian Humayd al-Muhalli that is preserved in only very few manuscripts, and this is one of them. Of special value is further Al-Masal al-Nafi'ah. It's another theological text by the 19th century Zaydi theologian Al-Hasan al-Mu'ayyidi al-Dahyani, which was transcribed, as you can see in the colophon, from the author's rough copy, and was completed in September 1898. Again, this is the only text, the only manuscript of this text that we have. Extremely important is what is preserved in the library from the Mu'tazili tradition. Here, the library holds copies of three particularly prominent works of the tradition. First of all, the theological Summa, again incomplete in the beginning, by the title Al-Mu'tamad fi Usul al-Din by the 12th century Rukn ad-Din ibn al-Malahimi. In the middle then, volume 2 of Abu Hussein al-Basri's work on legal theory, Al-Mu'tamad fi Usul al-Fiqh, which was written in the early 11th century and was extremely popular among the Zaydis, but not only Zaydis, basically all around any legal school in the Islamic world. And an incomplete copy of the last volume of Al-Hakim al-Jishmi's Sharh Uyun al-Masal, which is another huge encyclopedic theological summa, which in this part contains detailed discussions on substances, physics, and biology from a Mu'tazili theologian's point of view, which was written again towards the end of the 11th century. Now this work is attested, or this part of the work is attested only in two other manuscripts, one of them in Sanaa and the other one in Riyadh. Now, of course, this collection was hardly known up until now, so the only manuscript that has been used for any critical edition so far is Ibn al-Malahimi's Mu'tamad fi Usul al-Din. The editor of the Mu'tamad fi Usul al-Fiqh of Abu Hussein al-Basri did not know about this manuscript, so the edition was published without taking into consideration this manuscript. And the third one, this huge theological summa by Al-Hakim al-Jishmi, has not been published at all. It's very comparable in size with the earlier mentioned Abd al-Jabbar al-Hamadani's Moni, certainly consisting of 10 parts, but each one of them really a very huge part. The library also has 12 material, which is typical for the Zaydis, as I mentioned before. And a very interesting example is a copy of a work that was written by Tavashi of the 13th century, which is well known in Iran and in Tavashi circles, but it also circulated, and this is completely unknown for scholars of Tavashism, it also circulated in Yemen, and interestingly enough, it circulated under a different title, but only in Yemen, only among the Zaydis. If you read any study about this author and his works among scholars of Tavashism, you don't find this mentioned because no one knows about this. Now, the oldest codex in the collection is a multi-text volume containing, among other things, the Assemblies, the famous Assemblies, a literary text by al-Hariri of the 12th century, which was copied only 100 years roughly after the death of the author. And this is followed by a precious copy of al-Mawardi's Ahkam al-Sultaniyah, which was completed even earlier. Now, both works are extremely popular in the Sunni world, have been printed countless times, have been translated into English and other languages, and no editor up until now, no scholar was aware that the earliest witnesses of these two texts are in fact in Yemen among the Zaydis. And that has been completely ignored. And this is not an exception with this library. You find this in many of the Yemeni library that even for mainstream texts, so-called mainstream texts, you find earlier witnesses in Yemen than you find anywhere else in the Islamic world. Completely unknown. Other than that, the majority of the manuscripts in the collection were produced during the 14th through 19th century, in addition to 8 manuscripts that were transcribed, according to al-Hadi at least, during the 20th century. The overall ratio is again typical for the majority of Yemeni libraries. Of course, it's clear that the manuscript tradition continued much longer in Yemen than is the case in anywhere else in the Islamic world. The ZNT project will help to bring more of the enormous richness and intellectual diversity of Islamic culture to the forefront and make it accessible for users worldwide. Moreover, it is particularly the rational heritage of Islamic thought, epitomized by the doctrinal thought of the Mu'tazila, which had been embraced by the Zaydis since the 9th century, that is exclusively preserved in Yemen. Salvaging this material and making it accessible to a wider audience in the Islamic world will thus render a service to Muslim intellectuals in their attempt to formulate new vistas to harmonize religion and modernity. Let me end with yet another quotation from Irina Bokova, outgoing Director General of UNESCO. World heritage is built on the idea that there are cultural and natural heritages of universal value that we must protect together. This is a responsibility we all share, and I believe that scholars can and should play a central role in this endeavor. And this immediately ties in with the mission statement of the Institute for Advanced Study as expressed, for example, in a memorandum submitted in April 1941 by the Institute's Faculty of Humanistic Studies, as we were called at the time. In these days of crumbling values, it falls to the lot of humanists to save learning and scholarship from extinction, and it is the privilege of institutes like ours to become the asylum, particularly of those studies which a period of upheaval considers of no use whatever. It may be the destiny of our institute and of similar centers to rescue what they can of a civilization about to suffer shipwreck. If the lights are not to go out for good and all, it will be because of a small handful of scholars here and elsewhere who are devoted to learning for its own sake. This is a point of view which is not popular just now. It is, however, of the utmost importance that it be understood and appreciated by those who have the future of the Institute in their hands. While those dramatic words were uttered against the background of the Nazi regime in Germany going into its 8th year, and most of continental Europe having been invaded by either German, Soviet, or Italian troops, the core message of the faculty's statement has still some bearing in our days, and has immediate relevance for scholarship that addresses threatened segments of the common intellectual history of mankind, as is the case with the Zaydi Manuscript tradition and the rational heritage of Islam. Efforts such as the Zaydi Manuscript Tradition Project require technical as well as financial support. My sincerest thanks go to Father Columba Stewart, Director of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, and his entire team, which serves as the repository for the Zaydi manuscripts. Hill Museum was established some 50 years ago and is nowadays the leading institution of its kind. It provides the latest technology and guarantees lasting sustainability for the ZNT project. I also gratefully acknowledge the enthusiastic support of a growing number of libraries who agreed to contribute their materials to the project. To date, we have agreements with the State Library of Berlin, the Austrian National Library, Leiden University Library, the Biblioteca dell'Accademia Nazionale dei Lincei Cosiana in Rome, the Columbia University Library, the Perry Castagnala Library at University of Austin at Texas, and the Bavarian State Library in Munich, and negotiations with additional libraries are underway. Thanks are also due to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, who graciously agreed to fund the development of the software application that runs the digital portal on the IAS website. I would also like to thank the Institute for Advanced Study, in particular its IT department, whose staff has supported the evolution of this project from the very beginning and continues to play an active role in its future development. Several years ago, before I was appointed to the IAS, I had already started to entertain the idea to create a virtual library of the Zaydi manuscript tradition that would bring together the material that is dispersed all over the world and to make it accessible to scholars worldwide. But it's only here at the IIS that I received the necessary technical support to realize this dream. And for this, I'm very grateful. Apart from this, the ZMT project, which has by now close to 1,000 datasets, is a labor of love that is based on donations of digitized materials from libraries, institutions, and individuals, as well as considerable personal funds. Its continued success will eventually depend on future donations. Thank you.
Question?
Sure.
Go ahead. You're taking.
Okay. I think they have microphones, or okay.
You do have them.
No, you see, I was thinking about Maimonides, when he worked in Alexandria with Muslim scholars, and I was thinking about Maimonides when he worked in Alexandria with Muslim scholars, and he created his masterpiece, which was the interpretation of the Bible based on parables. Now, the question I have is, first of all, the question is the Muslim view of the Bible also an interpretation? Do they have their own parables? And also, I shouldn't forget that at that time Maimonides wrote a letter to the Jews of Yemenite because of the persecution. Okay, so the question is, what is the approach of the Muslims to the Bible? Are there parables like Maimonides, and also relating to the issue at Yemen at that time with the persecution? Okay, and Maimonides was a universalist also, as you know.
Right. Thank you. Well, many questions in one small question. First of all, I don't know whether you mean the Muslim exegesis of the Quran or the Bible.
The Bible.
Okay, the Bible. So the Bible, this is a huge field, and I can only give you some glimpses. But basically, the Muslim notion of the Bible is that, let's distinguish between...
The Torah.
Yes, so we have the Hebrew Bible, we have the New Testament, and we have the Quran. So the Muslim notion is, as also the Christians have it, that there is a sequence in revelations of God. That first the Hebrew Bible was revealed, then it was abrogated by the New Testament, which is again another dispensation of God, and those two were then again abrogated by the highest stage of revelation of dispensation, which is the Quran. So in one position, and the firm position of the Muslims, is to say that the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament have been abrogated by the last dispensation, which is the Quran. So they are no longer valid. On the other hand, and their contradiction starts, and the relation of the Muslims towards the Bible is full of contradictions. The other position and the other consequence of this notion is to say that, okay, the Bible has been abrogated, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, but they are divine dispensations. So what is actually said in these two scriptures is God's word. So one of the consequences is that Muslims do use the Bible, for instance, to look for alleged predictions of the Prophet Muhammad, as did the Christians. The same thing with the Christians. They take the Hebrew Bible and look, especially in the book of Isaiah, which is wonderful for that purpose. They go through the earlier dispensations, look for passages which they can interpret as alleged predictions of Muhammad, and this is how they use the Bible. Interestingly enough, the list that we have of predictions, especially from the Hebrew Bible, are very much in parallel to the Christians' list that we have. So you think that they kind of used the same lists, apparently. So that's one position. But then, again, and that's another level of contradiction, the Muslims also say, okay, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament are divine dispensations, but both the Jews and the Christian distorted their scriptures. So of course, and this is a complete contradiction, because if this is so, then you can't use the biblical text at all. And one of the proofs that is typically cited by the Muslims to show, to argue for this, is that the many translations of the Bible that have been done over the centuries, whereas the Quran, the Muslims have a very reserved position towards translating the Quran. It's usually said it's just interpreting because the Arabic language is part of the revelation. It cannot be really translated, whereas both Jews and Christians don't seem to have a problem. Now, the interesting thing is, and if you go over the centuries, the biblical material is used extensively. Some use it more, some use it less. But the interesting thing is that despite these many contradictions, Muslim scholars use the text and still insist on the contradictions. So this is my answer to your question. It's not an answer to the question you actually posed, but it's too complicated. But this is the rough picture. Now, the persecution. I didn't talk about this, but this is a field I'm working on very intensively, looking at the shared intellectual heritage of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in rational sciences, philosophy, legal theory, even rational theology. The ties are extremely close. But we should not forget that intellectual vicinity, intellectual exchange, does not imply tolerance in a modern sense. I'm reading, let's say I'm a Jewish philosopher, you're a Muslim philosopher. I'm interested in what you say. I read every word. I discuss with you for hours and hours and hours. But we both agree that each one of us has the right religion. You don't accept me being a Jew. I don't accept you being a Muslim. And this intellectual play, this intellectual interplay, which is there, should not be, you cannot take it as tolerance. So of course there was persecution. Of course there were problems in the society and persecution and whatever. But still, these are two different things.
Thank you very much. Dankeschön.
Bitte.
Somebody back there.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. I have two separate questions, two very different questions. One is about the point that you made, which I found very interesting, about some of the oldest manuscripts being in Yemen, for example, of the Maqamat and the Ahkam al-Sultaniya. Just how does one explain that some of the oldest versions are to be found in Yemen, of all places? I wouldn't have expected that. And the second question has to do with sort of what is happening on the ground in Yemen. And can you speak a little bit? I mean, I'm sure that the situation is very difficult, of course, but if you could speak a little to the experience of collaborating with Yemeni scholars on the ground, aside from sort of daily unexpected things that happen in a battle zone, in terms of long-term collaborations. I mean, what sorts of skills are you outsourcing to them? How has that been, et cetera? I'd just like to hear more about that. Thank you.
Right, thank you. About the first question, I think part of the astonishment is simply that the manuscripts of Yemen have never been within the purview of scholars, of scholarship. And I'm not only speaking about Western scholarship, but scholarship worldwide, because there have been no cataloging, no nothing. And it's simply, it is also a place where we have an even larger number of private small collections, where in other places these things, I mean, over the course of the 20th century, I mean, still like in Iran and Turkey, we still have private libraries. But the tendency has always been to integrate them in larger libraries. I mean, donating them, or these larger libraries have been buying them, etc. Everything started later in Yemen, plus, of course, destruction and everything. So simply no one was aware of that. That's one thing. And the other thing is, despite the turmoil-filled history of Yemen, Yemen is a place where you had, up until 62, you had a continuity of a dynasty, the Zaydis, of 1,000 years, which is amazing. I mean, which other place in the Islamic world could you cite where you have a dynasty that continues or continued being there for 1,000 years? And that, of course, led to the situation that many of the libraries that have been founded in the 12th, 13th century, I mean, both the large rulers' library, but also smaller libraries, private libraries, family libraries, also mosque libraries, had continued all over those centuries, which is rare to find anywhere else in the Islamic world. And I think we cannot overestimate this transfer of material that started in the 12th century from, I mean, it started from northern Iran, but it was much more than this. I mean, wherever we had enclaves of Zaydi scholarship learning, things trickled into Yemen by scholars going out and studying and bringing back books. And if you think at the one map, if you think of the geographical positioning of Yemen, yes, it is very isolated. Especially, I mean, the Zaydis are up in the mountains, and it's a couple of 1,000 meters high. It's really high. But if you think about the Arabian Peninsula, Mecca is not very far. So in addition to everything that came from northern Iran, partly also from Iraq, you also have the element of the Hajj. And Mecca, I mean, everyone going there doing pilgrimage, including, of course, Yemeni Zaydis, that was really one of the places where material was exchanged. So, and this is one of the reasons why these things ended up in Yemen. And then you have these libraries with this old history and with this unusual level of stability, which then allows for the preservation of this material. But I think a systematic working on the holdings of those libraries will yield many surprises, not only for people in Zaydi studies or Shi'i studies, but also in completely different fields. Now, on the ground, what's happening? That's a loaded question. I think it was 2010 that I've been the last time in Yemen, or 2011, I don't remember. I haven't been back. I can't go back. Even at the time, whenever I was there, I could never leave Sana'a. I was never in Şa'da, for instance, because it was impossible for non-Yemenis. It was simply too dangerous. It's impossible. So what is happening now? I don't know. I mean, watch the news. I mean, I think this is what is happening. It's a tragedy. For the project, at the time, I mean, the two projects I was mentioning, the one funded by the German Foreign Office of 2010 and the other one, NEH and DFG, 2010 to 13, I was a PI in both of them. And at the time, we did work with the Imam Zaid bin Ali Culture Foundation that I mentioned before, we provided them with the technical equipment, and they did photograph the manuscript holdings of a very select number of private libraries. But that is all past. I mean, nowadays, there is nothing that can be done on the ground. But on the other hand, the project in its current state is concerned with everything that has already been done and is dispersed, and no one makes sure this is being integrated and made available in some form to everyone. And this is what I'm trying to achieve with this project. What is being newly digitized, I mean, provided I get the funding, because that's really expensive, it is, of course, all the Western collections, which is, as I mentioned before, taken together, we're talking about 11,000 manuscripts, plus minus. And as you can imagine, I mean, those people who collected and those people who sold the manuscripts, they knew what to choose. So I showed you the two examples from Berlin of the 12th century, both of them unique manuscripts. And that is just some few examples out of many, many, many. Apart from especially the library in the Great Mosque. I mean, let's put it differently. I don't want to judge, but imagine if the ratio I mentioned to you is in Yemen we have something between 40,000 to 100,000 manuscripts. I mean, that's the very rough estimate we have. In Europe and the US, we have allowed about 11,000 manuscripts. So in terms of figures, this is much less. In terms of significance, they are equal. Because these 11,000 manuscripts that we have in the West, the majority among them are extremely valuable. And in Yemen, you have extremely valuable stuff, of course, too, but you also have, I mean, especially in the 17th century, we have hundreds and thousands of manuscripts and often hundreds of manuscripts of the same text that was super popular and was taught in all the madrasas. We have hundreds of manuscripts of that. And the 17th century seems to be the peak in the production of manuscripts. So in terms of numbers, that sounds a lot, but it's in terms of significance, these are not the super most significant manuscript copies. So I don't know. I can't really tell you anything about what's happening now. But nothing is happening in terms of saving anything.
Excuse me, I'm going to have to interrupt here because I have a privileged position in the sense that I can look out at all of you, and it's remarkable to me what a degree of interest there is in this audience today. It's quite remarkable. You should be very proud. But before we applaud you, let me just say, I think we do need to take one more question, and I'm going to let you choose who does it.
No, you choose.
You choose. And then maybe Sabine will be good enough to stay around. She's going to be available down the hall for coffee and...
No, we have a wine and cheese reception down the hall, and Sabine will be there, so we can continue the conversation.
Okay.
We have paperwork out there, so if you want to read more, there's tons of stuff to take.
Clearly there is interest. And so you're going to pick the last big question from the whole group, and then we can have smaller questions in smaller groups. And then we're going to have to stop.
Well, the first hand I see is Sebastian.
Many thanks and profound thanks for drawing our attention to these precious heritage from Yemen, and also talking about the efforts the Institute is making to help make these texts available. My question is, you spoke about the relatively large number of rationalist theological texts in these collections. To what extent are these texts today studied in the theological seminaries? Is it possible to say anything about this in this regard?
You mean in Yemen?
Yes.
Well, yes and no. You know, the Yemeni, the Zaydis, I mentioned before, I mean, sorry, this is a complicated answer to simple questions. But I mentioned before that the Zaydis, strictly speaking, are Shi'is because they believe that the successor of the Prophet must come from the house of the Prophet, from the Hashemi family. So they are Shi'is. On the other hand, in many of the doctrines, they are kind of between the Twelver-Shi'is and the Sunnis, which also means that in terms of hadith, tradition, prophetic traditions, unlike the Twelver-Shi'is, they accept the authenticity and the validity of Sunni hadith collections. So what happens, especially in Yemen, I mean the only place where from the 15th century on we have Zaydis, what happens is a slow, and it started earlier, a slow gradual Sunnification of the Zaydis with people like Shawkani in the 18th century. And today, I mean, the whole conflict in Yemen between the Salafis and the Houthis is the conflict between the Zaydis and the Salafis starting centuries earlier. It seems to be a political conflict. It's a religious conflict at the very beginning. Now, that of course led to the situation that whereas the Zaydis, they are looking at the Mu'tazili rational heritage as part of their own heritage. Because it's really from the 9th century that the Zaydis became Mu'tazilis. With al-Hadi, he is the first true Mu'tazili. I mean, he adopts the positions. Whereas those who lean towards the Sunnification and became eventually Salafis, they are against that. They don't like that. So what you have this partition between the Zaydis, nowadays Houthis, who like the heritage also of the Mu'tazilis, which they adopt as their own, and you have those who are no longer define themselves as Zaydis, who are completely against this, who are really Salafis, against anything rational. I mean, the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, I mean, the worst people on earth. I mean, only politicians don't see that. But these are the worst people, I mean, to speak for Islam. So they are, of course, against all these kind of things. So yes and no. And you can see, especially in the early 20th century, you have a couple of thinkers who kind of really mourn this lost heritage of Mu'tazili rationalism, which is lost, but they still, I mean, they have the material, they have the manuscripts, and they still try to integrate these things into their works and are proud of this heritage. So, yes and no. But here we have a mosque library, and we have Mu'tazili texts in this. Also, the Umdat al-Mustashidin, Humayd al-Muhalli, he's a Mu'tazili. So that has clearly been studied in this area. And Şa'da is very much, of course, a place where Zaydis, I mean, that's where also the Houthis have their stronghold. There was one question that was not asked. May I answer that?
Answer it.
No, that has not been asked because
No, you answer whatever it has been.
Yes, okay, thank you. Because no one asked me, why do you think that digital repositories solve the question in a place like Yemen where there's no electricity, no computers, no nothing? Right, you all wanted to ask me this, right? And you didn't dare. You're right. Yes.
Why you do digitalization? There's no photographer's type and there's no measurements.
I'm working with what they did at the time. I'm working on I mean, of course, what I get from Western libraries is fine. What I get from whatever has been done, it's partly scanned microfilms, it's partly what people have photographed, partly it's bad, but this is what we have. And we cannot come with our standards and say, well, this is not good enough, or this is all we have. And in many cases, the scans we have, the microfilms we have is all that is left, because the libraries, as you saw, are destroyed, including the holdings. Now, of course, you can say, digitalization is nice. We're sitting in America. We have computers. We have internet. Everything is fast. But this is not so in the third world. Not so in Yemen. You're right. On the other hand, there's no other way. At least I don't know of any other way to be more effective in making it available to people for those who have the possibilities. Of course, there are always those who have not. But if you look at this example. This is the Facebook site of Jamal Ashami. He's sitting in Şa'da, the place you saw where the bombing came, and this guy is amazing. He posts, I mean, somehow he manages to post constantly on Facebook, and I know he's sitting in Şa'da. And not only this, he is also able to access digital repositories of Western libraries and to get manuscripts out of there. So what this guy is doing, and here's an example. For instance, this is a manuscript from Berlin. He went into the digital repository of Berlin, which has a few Zaydi manuscript digitized. He downloads the stuff. He makes an edition, puts the facsimile, and kind of produces a PDF, puts a self-made title page, and says, this is published. But not only it's published, of course, I'm sure it was never printed. And there's no publisher. I never saw a publisher. But what he is doing, and that is the most wonderful way of sharing. I mean, first of all, if you see this, I mean, you think, why are we complaining, sitting in the West, wonderful conditions, and still we complain about the bad situation of scholars that we have today? This is hard scholarship. So this guy puts this together, has a nice PDF, puts it on a server, and sends it into the world, posts about it, and people can download it. So he not only uses the material that is being provided through digital repositories in the West, he works on them, makes an edition. I mean, it's kind of semi-critical, but still, I mean, it's a text, and gives it back to the world. I mean, how better could it be? And this is, I mean, if you see this, I mean, you don't have any words. And it's, I find this a wonderful encouragement that the digital way of doing this is actually the way to do it. And somehow people figure out how to get to this stuff if they're really interested. I'm also encouraged, I have colleagues from Egypt and other places who have their own personal collections of Yemeni manuscripts. I mean, partly digitized microfilms or better digitized images, different things. They send it to me, ask me, we have this, we want to share it, we don't know how to share it, please put it into your repository so that everyone can use it. That's from Egypt. And again, I mean, this is, I find this heartbreaking. This is wonderful, and this is also how international scholarship should work. I mean, we are all sharing, we are all part, I mean, we are all responsible for this, for this cultural heritage of mankind in a way, and we all share, and we all do whatever we can do. So from my end, the digital solution is the best I can offer. I don't have a better solution, it's not ideal, but to some extent it seems to work, and I mean, hopefully the future will be better than what we are seeing nowadays, and then even more people can profit from it.